I'd like to do two things today. One is to give you some foundation and some background on NOAA's Digital Coast, the partnership and the like, and then drive through a couple of the tools just to give you some flavor of the content on the Digital Coast, and hopefully to provide fodder for some questions later on. So your three things memo, right? You got a minute on an elevator, and how do you explain something? So the Digital Coast is three things. It's information and data delivery. For all you propeller heads, a lot of technical information in there about integrated tools, training, coastal data, and the like. It's also very much about partnerships and a relationship and a national scale, and the constituent-driven approach to driving content on a website and in a partnership, and then an enabling platform. As Dave mentioned just now, you know, none of this is relevant unless it has application in the real world, unless it drives material, behavioral change on the ground. And so all of this data is not important unless it has an end result in that regard. And so the Digital Coast is also an enabling platform that hopefully drives that end state of information to maps to application and use. So the partnership, let me just speak to that for a minute. You might see some familiar faces in the audience here. But this partnership's a really important one for the Digital Coast. There are 9 members from our organization to the ASFPM to APA to NACO to Nature Conservancy, National Estuarine Research Reserves, to the Urban Land Institute, Nature Conservancy. What do you notice about this partnership that you might not notice about others? It's very diverse, right? And so if you surround yourself with the same people all the time talking about the same issues, you run the risk of becoming irrelevant, right? So the diversity of partnerships is hugely important around common themes. And when we designed and thought about conceptually what a Digital Coast partnership might look like, we really wanted to diversify the partnerships so it touched a lot of different constituents, right? Because all of these things that I'll talk about today are constituent-driven and based on needs. And this partnership keeps us honest in that regard. Otherwise, you know, if you just go out and develop happy tools looking for a problem to solve, you're going to become irrelevant. And so one of the things that we pride ourselves on around the Digital Coast is really tapping into our partnerships to keep the process honest, to really get feedback on what constituents' needs are so that they drive the content on the Digital Coast, and it's really constituent needs. And it gets back to Dave's point. If you start with that in the front end in terms of what are the needs in the field, you have a much better chance of driving the end state of application. We also have a lot of contributors of information to the Digital Coast, right? There are a lot of people that produce data, right? A lot of it is one-off. There are very few constructs in this country around technical information that archive data, that maintain data, and that serve the data back to the public in a very holistic way. And one of the things that we pride ourselves on in the Digital Coast is to be that repository for a number of different organizations at the federal level, state level, NGO level, certainly academics and the private sector. So if you're looking for holistic data sets, national data sets, contributions, and this is just a sampling of the partners that contribute data and resources to the Digital Coast. The Digital Coast is not a NOAA thing. It is a partnership, as I described in the broad sense, but many contributors of data around that, and I'll give you some ideas and examples of that in a second. So by the numbers, the data is important, of course, and there are about 70 plus terabytes of high-res data for coastal land cover, for ortho-imagery, for LIDAR, for bathymetry and the like, linkages to 40 other national data sets. So if you are a data geek and you are really looking for LIDAR data or other kinds of things, I would encourage you to go check it out on the Digital Coast. Certainly it is about tools. Tools can be very important if they are about constituent needs and driven to application, and there are 60 plus tools. A lot of it is around visualization and analyzing data with the idea of having the end state of application. Capacity building is hugely important. ASFPM is all about capacity building and training, right? And that digital coast theme and our partnership with ASFPM is around that as well. And so I would encourage you to go check it out as well on the training components of that. About 140 learning resources in there, both from instructor-led to self-driving. You know, you can go in there and play it yourself, home study and YouTubes and all those kinds of things. Stories from the field, also on the digital coast. Conceptual ideas just do not sell. What sells are experience-based examples of applications of products and tools on the ground. And so we have tried very hard to develop this library or portfolio of case studies, best practices, whatever you want to call them, where you can have your third-party validators coming in and saying, here's how we use these digital coast products to solve this problem. And so the goal here is to have a portfolio of these case studies across the country, geographically distributed, diversity of applications, to arguing the point for why data application is hugely important to drive public policy in this country. But you can get up there and talk to an elected official all day about your program, but unless they hear it from their constituents in a third-party validation, it won't sink in as well. And so the idea of these stories from the field is hugely important to get at application of innovation. So in the broadest spectrum, discovering data is important, downloading it is important, mapping it, as we've heard, is hugely important, analyzing it analytically, certainly. But all of that is not necessarily as important as the last two steps, where you're taking data to information and information to action, right? Hugely important. If you cannot demonstrate this spectrum, might as well not even attempt it. And it starts with the constituent needs on the ground that drive that process to sharing data. So just a snapshot of how we see this evolution in bringing maps to application on the ground, and as Dave said, having material and behavioral change on the ground is where it's at. So I'll drive through a couple of tools. One is our sea level rise viewer tool, and the second is our coastal county snapshots. Just a show of hands so I can get a feel. How many of you have heard of Digital Coast in the audience? That's great. How many of you have used Digital Coast products and tools? Good. That's great. That's great, because you get into these audiences and you wonder, you know, are you going to be the coastal anomaly? You know, are you going to have... But I would also encourage you folks that are in riverine environments to check out the Digital Coast, because you will find, I'm confident, a lot of material that's transferable to your areas as well. So let's drive through this Digital Coast tool and this Sea Level Rise Viewer tool for a second. It is essentially a visualization tool with a lot of other things that allow you to analyze and to tell a story about sea level rise. But it could be about simple inundation as well. So if you go, it has a slider bar from 1 to 6 feet, and it also has, in this case is in Charleston, South Carolina. You know, what's a statistic? Half the adult population can't read a map, right? And that's probably increasing with the advent of Siri and other things. People can't get from point A to point B reading a map anymore. So you have to have other ways to communicate risk. And so if you have a landmark on the ground, in this case like the Charleston Customs House, and you begin to visualize the impacts of rising water levels on noticeable landmarks, it may have more of a resonating than putting it on a map. And so you try to appeal to that communication of risk in several different dimensions. So if you just slide the bar up and go from, again, this could be sea level rise, it could be coastal storm surge, but you take that bar and you slide it up, and I should say that the base for this imagery is all pretty high resolution LiDAR, Google Earth imagery base, and so you can zoom in, zoom out. This is not necessarily the scale. You can control the scale, you can control it. And I should also say this is not predictive modeling. This allows you to just superimpose in a bathtub way water levels at an increasing and seeing how that interfaces with the built environment. So going up in the scale, you can see 3 feet, 4 feet, and all the way to 6 feet of flooding. And again, with a landmark like this. And you can inset different landmarks for different places. And this is a national data set, of course. It's in all of our coastal counties across the U.S. in the worst case scenario. So it also has some discussion in this tool about limitations of data. It's really important to know how far you can fly with confidence in explaining this data, what it can and can't do. So some of the uncertainties around the data is important to explain as well, in areas that might not be hydrologically connected, in areas that may be low marsh where you really are talking about micro levels of elevation and the like. So those uncertainties are explained in the Sea Level Rise Viewer tool. And then marshes, right? As sea levels rise over the next several decades, marshes aren't going to stand still, right? They're going to move. They're going to adapt as human beings will adapt. And so with the advent of some really decent ecological modeling, we now have some limited capability to predict where these marshes are going to migrate to and the species associated with them. So the Sea Level Rise Viewer tool attempts to take in that ecological forecasting as well. Also, some of you are familiar with SOVI data, Social Vulnerability Index information from Dr. Cutter in South Carolina is another layer in this particular data set. So you can see how the water interfaces with the people and the vulnerabilities of the populations. As well, you know, it's commonplace now on the eastern seaboard where you get high tide and the wind in the wrong direction, you can have flooding on a perfectly sunny day. Southeast Florida, Charleston, parts of Norfolk, Hampton Roads area. Increasingly, that's going to be an issue, and it's driving a lot of processes and decision-making in those eastern seaboard states now. And so this tool attempts to get at that shallow, that nuisance flooding, those sunny day things, and it ties it back to the NOAA tide gauge data so you can get a feel for those areas that on those non-event-driven flooding events will flood. So let's go to coastal county snapshots as well. And, you know, it's really hard to distill complex data into simple messages. Really hard in a risk communication way to do that. If you've got 5 minutes with your county official or your elected official, how do you convey the work you've been doing in the last year to them in 10 minutes at a board meeting? Really hard stuff. And so this tool attempts to get at that in a snapshot way, and I'll just give you some examples. So the coastal county snapshots have 3 themes really: flood exposure, ocean and Great Lakes economy information, as well as wetland benefits. And it allows you, the user, to download it as a PDF, print it off from your tabletop, and you're done, right? It's really meant to print and go, and I'll drive through it in a second. But these data sets exist at the county level, and so let's just zoom into Charleston County and drive through the tool just a little bit. Again, it has 3 themes associated with it. Let's go to the flood exposure thematic data, and you can see if you begin to print this out in a easy to understand kind of USA Today glimpse at this, you can see the demographics of flooding. You know, how much of my county is in the floodplain relative to poverty, how much of it is in the floodplain relative to the age population and the like, the demographics, critical facilities information and the like. But if you have to convey your concept in 5 minutes or less in front of people that are going to make decisions about your budgets, these kinds of messages are hugely important. Distilling your complex data into simple to get, simple to use, simple to understand graphic formats is hugely important to get to the end state of application. And so there's also, I should say in this, some planning next steps kinds of things, and it gives you the data sources as well. So let's go to the next theme, which is ocean economy data, right? If you live on the coast, you get it, right? Ports, tourism, recreation, fishing. The coastal economies are huge in this country, right? And they interface with some of the most high at-risk places in the country as well. And so we've got 2 drivers that are in collision the entire time with development, economic engines associated with very high-risk areas. But in order to really be an effective floodplain manager, it helps immensely in the coast to understand what those economic drivers are and the GDP drivers, because economies relate to politics, relate to decision-making about floodplain use. And so getting the information around your coastal economies, what the drivers are for those economic engines as it relates to your at-risk areas can be very helpful. These coastal county snapshots using National Ocean Watch economic information can help you get at that in a snapshot way. And you can look at regional economies as well. So the last thing I'll mention with this particular tool is the wetlands information. So you can also produce a county snapshot, again, print screen, Go, you have the information, front and back, one pager, about the wetlands data and the distribution in your county. So I'll just conclude by saying, please go to the website, drive through some training. There's a lot in there for everybody, a number of on-demand products, a number of scheduled courses and the like, capacity building around floodplain management, among other things. And the last thing I'll say is there's a library and a portfolio of stories from the field. Again, these are the things that sell. Applied information that's driving action on the ground, telling that story, and it's not us telling that story, it's the third-party validators at the local level that have used this information for public works decisions, for floodplain management, for whatever. Check out the Library of Information. We're always looking to build that. The last thing I'll leave you with is just how to find us. Digital Coast, if you do nothing else, check it out on the website, Twitter, Facebook, and we're done. Thanks.